Today in the Hobby Bench, I'll be painting Blade for Marvel Crisis Protocol. Today I'll be painting Blade, and you can see I have it primed gray. So primarily I'm going to be painting it black, but I'm going to also work a little bit on some contrast, working it there on the cape, and then also maybe looking more at the spectral hands that they have there. And so for something like that, it has a fair amount of detail. I'll probably use some contrast paints on that, especially on the underfolds there. I think a nice red will work pretty well with that. So to start off, for the areas I'm going to use contrast paints, I dry brushed white over that. And if you've seen a video I have working with contrast paints, I found out really that's what you sort of need. You need to have that white highlight to really make those contrast paints work. So as I worked up on the cape and there on the hands, use special paint. So I'm giving a black coat now, and this will be going through most of the model. Pretty standard here. I'm going to just use even coverage, try to give a nice solid coat over to it. And it's nothing too fancy here. Thinned out pretty well. So you just want to give a nice even coat going through everything. And that'll be pretty much the foundation for most of the figure and for most of his uniform that I have. So now you can see that I've got all the black blocked in for his uniform, including up his cape and then his costume. Of course, I'm trying to avoid a little bit back there underneath the cape. That's where I'm going to have the contrast paints. So for now, I'm going to go through and give a dark blue gray dry brush and give it good coverage, get it over everything as well as I can. What you want to try to do is just sort of pick out the highlights that I've got there. Nothing too fancy in this. Just looking at points that you think are going to catch probably most of the light primarily, but just really giving a good coverage over here just to sort of bring some contrast to that black uniform. Now that I've got that dry brush coat down, you can sort of see now I've got a bit more highlight going on over that black uniform. So I'm going to add a little bit more detail here. I'm going to be using neutral gray. I'm going to mix that in just about 1-to-1 with the dark blue gray. So just mix that through pretty well. And here I'm just going to really sort of focus on trying to get highlights of upper areas that I think are going to catch more of the light. Just slowly working that in there. Best if you can is trying to look out sometimes from the top down, sort of seeing what you think that might get. So I'm going to look a little bit more on his knee pad here, for example, and some of the creases on his pants. That's what I'm sort of focusing on, because I figured like that's something that's really going to catch quite a bit of light and really sort of stand out a little bit more. So, that's where I sort of want to give just a little bit more of that lighter gray. And here you can see I have a few coats of dry brushing down of the light gray over his black uniform, so I'll bring out some detail. And now I'm going to be working with red velvet, and I just absolutely love this contrast paint. So I'm going to do the underside of his cape with that, and it's really a gorgeous, gorgeous red. Nice deep red color, and I really think it will give us nice contrast to his black costume. So I'll be painting up the lapels here and work my way a little bit more into the back of the folds of his coat, of his undercoat, for his cape. And here you just want to sort of be careful, just trying not to get really spread that out over the rest of his uniform. And just carefully go through there and let that contrast paint do its work. Here I have his cape done with those Xpress contrast paints, and really like the offsetting colors of his red cape with his black uniform. It's really cool. So now I'm going to be painting up his skin, so I'm using flat brown as the base tone for that. It's a lovely brown going over his skin, and as with many paints that you're working with, you just want to thin that out. Work with a nice coat, possibly do 2. This gives a pretty good coverage though, so I probably usually get away with these in 1 coat. And I'll just work this in very carefully, trying to avoid getting too much on a lot of the other details that I painted up. So I've got that base coat done. And I want to give a little bit more detail, so I use a very thinned out wash of sepia ink just to capture a little bit more of that detail that's on his face that I couldn't quite get. And I'm mixing in now, giving a little bit more of a highlight using Mahogany Brown, mixed in with that flat brown, usually a 1-to-1. And it's just to darken that lighter shade just a bit. And so I'm going to just sort of blend that in pretty well. Have this very thinned out. And the idea here is just to go through and try to pick out a little bit more of the details and leave that darker shade, maybe for the recesses that's next to his hairline or to his glasses or his uniform. Just give it a little bit more of a darker area there. So I'm just going to be slowly picking this out here. Some more areas maybe on his forehead. They're going to capture more light. Just working my way through there. And this is very thinned out. So it's going to flow pretty well. And still be just, a little transparent, but just opaque enough. You can see also is working along his cheekbones, along his jawline, and slowly work through some other details on his face. And that's just sort of to bring that out a little bit here. So maybe on his chin, and working on his nose. This is the areas you think are going to catch light and just be a little bit of a lighter shade. And being thinned down, it blends out pretty well. And I'll be doing the same out for his forearms and working out on his hands too. So skin is done. I've got a good base coat of a brown down, and there's a little bit more of those thinned out highlights just to add a little bit more contrast. Of course, that sepia ink working there just to pick out a little bit more detail if it needs to. Now I'm going to be working more on the rest of his stuff and working on swords particularly. So I'm going to be using silver. I'll be doing a quick fast cuts here, but what I want to recommend when you're working with silver, this is really important. If you got your regular water, I always have an extra set of water that's just for metallic paints. And the same thing, you use it for like a palette. That'll be just for metallic paints. And that's just to avoid getting, any metallic flecks in my other paints. So I've got that set up here, and now I'm just going to sort of work on his belt buckle. And I'll be doing some quick cuts here just to sort of highlight some of the process that I had here. So just carefully paint that belt buckle. And now I'm going to be moving on to his swords. So I'm working on the haft of the sword and the butt of it. And on the blade guard, we'll be moving up to it next. And just going to give an even coat of the silver. And it's a gorgeous color. It's very bright. And you can actually get some pretty good coverage out of it. So it doesn't necessarily need to be really thinned down. And you can give, just basically, it's usually like one coat, really good enough. And this is going to just really make his blades just stand out and, pop quite a bit. So I've got his swords painted up with that silver. And I'm going to add a little bit of some darker shading to that using Gunmetal Grey. It's a darker metallic color. So the idea here is to try to maybe get on the bottom of his blades and maybe some parts on his the hilt and the blade guards, just to give it a little bit of a darker shade. And I'm also going to probably go along the blades themselves too, so break it up somewhat. And I'm going to be doing some pretty quick and fast cuts here. You can see I'm just slowly working on the bottom of that. And that's just sort of to break that up a little bit of that silver color, just to add, a little bit more definition, if you will, maybe a little bit more shading you could get. Just sort of working on the bottom of those blades, getting on the bottom of his hilt. And just working through that pretty carefully. You can see now I'm going to be sort of working through a bit more into the blade itself. And the idea here is just to sort of, it's going to be this long silver blade, just to maybe add a little bit of gradation of color. I'm going to be using this Gunmetal Grey to sort of break that up a little bit. Here I've worked that Gunmetal Grey into the silver blade just to break up the color a little bit and add this a little bit of a different metallic look. Now I'm really going to bring out the edges of the blade and give it some more highlight just using plain white. And I'm just going to work that through there on the blade itself, just on the areas I think it definitely going to be catching much more of the light. And there'll be some quick and fast cuts going through this, but I just want to show that out there. And this is also me working a little bit in the Gunmetal Grey in the middle there, just to add sort of that shine, that metallic look that might capture of like polished metal. So this is just very thin, working through that. So here's the final result. I sort of got that white worked in the blade. And I've also touched a little bit on his teeth for his fangs, sort of make those stand out a bit more. So now I'm going to be working on the spectral hands. And I think I'm just going to use a new color here. It's Iceberg Gray, and maybe try to give it a little bit more of a subtle look. So just like your typical contrast here, I'm just going to be trying to give a nice even coat. And with that white dry brush there, it really helps bring out some of the detail of all those hands and allow that contrast paint to work a little bit more. So you're just going to be covering a good even coat, trying to be careful not to get into the other areas that you painted. And I don't know how this will look, but hopefully it'll give a good color, a good base to these spectral hands. So the spectral hands are done. I feel the Iceberg Gray gave it a wonderful look. Now I need to do a little bit of touch-ups here. I'm going to be using a thin down coat of black just to give some slight shades a little bit more to emphasize some of the folds on his coat, especially on his cape. I've got some areas that have those crevices. I really want to bring out that black, so that's going to be using, including, just doing a little bit of touch-ups of some of the base coats I had for his skin and such, and clean that up a little bit. And with that, blade is just about done. So I've used that black to give it some slight shading, just a touch. You can see a bit of folds in his pants there, just to give some more definition on that. Now for the brickwork and for the grading, I used Commando green Xpress paint, and I also used Dwarf skin for the brick. Pretty subtle colors. And that's what I wanted, to try to have stuff, even for the spectral hands, nothing that adds too much bright shades. Really the belt buckle, and you can see the red on his cape, that sort of draws you into the figure. So everything else here, it's much more subdued, and that's what I really wanted to, sort of highlight your eye looking more at the figure rather than necessarily looking at his base. So I want to try to avoid using some bright colors or bright greens, etc. But there you go. Really happy how he looks. Dig it. Can't wait to get him to the tabletop.